From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everybody. And I'm Mary Jane Deeb. I'm chief of the African Middle East Division. And it is really an honor and a pleasure to welcome Sam Brylawski and Karen Lund today, who will make this wonderful presentation in honor of Jewish American Heritage Month. In fact, Peggy Perstein is at the White House on the occasion of the Jewish American Heritage Month, and she's making, with others, a display of materials from our collections. This is why she's not here today to welcome you all. But I'm here, and I'm delighted to welcome you. This is the reading room of the African Middle East Division. We have 3 sections. We have the Hebraic section, who's hosting the program today with the Motion Picture, Broadcasting, and Recorded Sound Division. And we thank you for being a partner with us on this, in this event. And we have the Near East section, and we have the African section. And the room in which you're sitting holds the reference collections of the three sections. We are probably the division that is responsible for one of the largest number of countries, 77 countries in all, and numerous languages in the vernacular. And so our mission is not only to collect, to keep, to help researchers when they come in for resources, but also to make those resources available not only as artifacts, but through the scholars who have used those collections, who have written books, composed music, created works of importance using those collections. And we do this when we invite them to come and talk about the work that they have done. And certainly today, this is a case in point, and we have Sam Brylawski and Karen Lund, who will be speaking about Emile Berliner. We have his grandson, who couldn't be with us today, but who will be coming in the fall to make a presentation of his own on the subject. But first, to introduce the speakers today is our senior reference librarian in the Hebraic section. Sharon will be here. Thank you, Sharon. Sharon Horowitz.
On behalf of the Hebraic section, African and Middle Eastern Division, and the Motion Picture, Broadcasting, and Recorded Sound Division, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Emile Berliner and the Birth of the Recording Industry. My name is Sharon Horowitz. As you heard, I'm a reference librarian in the Hebraic section. A few words about Emile Berliner. Mr. Berliner, 1851 to 1929, was a German-born immigrant whose inventions contributed to the birth of the recording industry. A largely self-educated man, Mr. Berliner was responsible for the development of the microphone, the flat recording disc, and the gramophone player. We are very fortunate to have 2 speakers today. Our first speaker will be Karen Lund. Karen is the digital project coordinator of the library's music division. Previously, she worked as the digital project leader for the Motion Pictures, Broadcasting, and Recorded Sound division. She has worked on the library's digital projects for 16 years. She will give us a tour of the library's Emile Berliner website. Then our second speaker will be Mr. Sam Brylawski. Sam is editor of the encyclopedic Discography of Victor Records, being compiled by the University of California at Santa Barbara, an authoritative index to more than 165,000 recording sessions. He retired from the library in 2004, where he was head of the recorded sound section in the Motion Picture Broadcasting and Recorded Sound Division. Sam writes and lectures on recordings and American popular music and audio preservation. One item of business before we begin. This event is being videotaped for subsequent broadcast on the library's webcast and other media. There will be a question and answer period after the presentation in which the audience is encouraged to ask questions and offer comments. Please be advised that your voice and image may be recorded and later broadcast as part of this event. By participating in the question and answer period, you are consenting to the library's possible reproduction and transmission of your remarks. And now, please join me in welcoming Ms. Lund and Mr. Brylawski.
Hi, thank you all for coming today. I'm going to give you a little tour of the website first, and then Sam is going to tell you more of the history of Emile Berliner and the gramophone. The site is available on American Memory. And first, I want to bring your attention to about the collection. The collection of the Emile Berliner collection consists of over 1,000 manuscript items, including correspondence, notes, papers, photographs, diaries, pamphlets. We also have a couple hundred Berliner gramophone recordings in the collection. To make the online presentation, we made a database of all the items in the collection, and then we selected the ones that we thought would be most interesting for users online. So the online collection has about 400 items from the manuscript collection and more than 100 sound recordings. And you can read more about it at your leisure. Most of the items were gotten from Berliner's descendants, Robert Sanders and Robert Frank, among others. The recordings, and Sam can correct me on this, I think most of those were purchases that the library made. I want to show you on the top here, you can search by keyword, you can browse by title, subject, series, name, index, or recordings. If you go into the series index, you'll get a good idea of the many things that are in the collection. One series was addresses that Emile Berliner had made. One, for example, was on the gramophone etching the human voice. And you can also see that he was a very diverse man. Not only was he an inventor, but he was very interested in public issues. He was very interested in Zionism. In fact, there's one address he gave on the social status of the Jews that you can access. So when we made the online collection, we focused mostly on the gramophone being his most important invention, but we also included other aspects of his life and his work to give a well-rounded picture of the man. There are articles and clippings that you can view. There are also books. One of the more interesting ones was a child's book he wrote entitled Muddy Jim and Other Rhymes. He was very interested in public hygiene programs. And he wrote this for children, trying to encourage them to be clean. A naughty lad was Muddy Jim. He hated soap and water. Nice little girls wouldn't speak to him, though he wished and thought they ought to. There are also several compilations of litigation that he went through concerning the gramophone and other inventions. So that's what the history of the telephone transmitter, the gramophone litigation, that's what you'd find under the book series. There are catalogs of the Berliner Gramophone Company, which would generally list some of the recordings that people could order through the company. There's quite a lot of correspondence You can see here many to family members and business associates. There are notes and papers. One thing that's sort of interesting is that he would just jot down ideas on any scrap of paper that he could find. So you would find on the back of stationery and other things, he would jot down various ideas, and we have those in the collection. There's also various pamphlets, patents, including some German ones for his inventions, recordings, scrapbooks. He collected quite a few scrapbooks. Most of them we've only put up excerpts of them, but we did put the entire scrapbook for the telephone, phonograph, graphophone, gramophone historical accounts. I think that, and Sam will probably elaborate more on this, but I think he wanted to guarantee his place in history by collecting all these articles and putting them in a safe place. This particular scrapbook was more difficult to digitize because, like many scrapbooks, people just put a whole bunch of clippings and images on top of one another that you would have to lift up. So what we did is we scanned every page just the way it was, and then scanned each item separately. So you can go to all of these items over here on the right and see the full item. So it's really quite interesting to go through what he felt was important, to document his career and his interests. There's a scrapbook on Palestine and Zionism. There's one on, we believe it was milk and health. He just put M and H. But he was very interested in the pasteurization of milk as a health issue. So it's very interesting to look through these things. He also had a scrapbook of the Berliner Edison controversy, because, and I'm sure Sam will go into more detail about, there's some controversy over who really invented the gramophone, and he wanted to be sure to collect all the items proving that he did. On the top of the page, you can also go to a list of the recordings from the Berliner Gramophone Company. They're divided up into categories. There are band and orchestra recordings. For example, you can listen to Sousa's band. Let's see if it... The Sousa band recorded many records for the Berliner Company. There's also various instrumentalists. There's comedy. There are popular vocalists of the day. There's classical and opera recordings. There's spoken word recordings, including a very rare recording by Buffalo Bill on the Spanish-American War. And I think this may be the only recording of it that has been found. It's a little scratchy, but still they're very important recordings, and these were done well over 100 years ago. There's some foreign language recordings, and there's also some recordings of Indian songs and dances online. And there's a few of Emile Berliner also speaking to his grandson, Bobby Frank. Robert Frank was one of the descendants that donated items to the collection. I want to show you this special presentation on Emile Berliner, inventor of the gramophone. If you want a little bit more history, if you find this interesting and you want more after this talk, there is an essay on the life of Emile Berliner. Very interesting man, lived in Washington, D.C., and as I said, he was very much a Renaissance man, interested in a lot of different things. There's an essay on the gramophone, the history of that, including illegal competition and his fights with other inventors. There's an essay about the Berliner recordings themselves, what kind of recordings they made, about the catalogs, how they numbered them. There's also a timeline. And finally, a family tree, which comes in handy when you're looking at the photographs of various family members, looking at the correspondence, and trying to figure out who this person is. He worked with several family members. His nephew was his business partner for a while, and so it's very useful to look at this. So if you want more information about how these items were actually digitized, there is a section on building the digital collection. I won't bore you now with the details, but if you find after the presentation you wonder, what file format something was made in or how we did something, you can look on this page to get all the information. There's also some related resources. When Berliner was making his inventions, it was also the same time there were other notable inventors, Alexander Graham Bell, Edison, Westinghouse. So we've put links to other presentations that we have on American Memory that deal with some of these inventors. It's very interesting to compare their notes and their histories and their interactions with each other. There is a presentation up from MBRS on Edison. There's one from the manuscript division on Alexander Graham Bell. There's also historic sheet music, which coincides with many of the recordings you're going to find on the Berliner label. There are also some outside websites about Emile Berliner and the Berliner Gramophone Company, and there's one in Canada, which is an excellent site, and a few others that you might want to check out. There were many people that worked on this site. I was the team leader for it, but in particular, Laura Gottesman and Marco Semioa worked on it. Many other people also helped out. They're listed in the acknowledgments. As I always tell people about these digital sites, they're always the work of many people, not just one or two people. And that's about it. You can search by the keyword. You can look under subjects. If you want to look up particular people, places. And now I'm going to let Sam take over and give you some of the history of Emile Berliner and his invention, the gramophone.
Karen. It's going to take me a few minutes to get set up, but I thought it would be good for Karen to start this presentation because all I'm doing here is sort of mining the work that Karen and her team did. These American Memory sites were really continue to be models of library archival sites of putting collections online. These aren't just websites, in that, as you see, it was started with a database of every item in the collection. Selections were made, organized thematically, context was provided, and the whole thing just made it very easy for me to come in here and sort of tap this collection and just delve into it a little bit to share some ideas about Berliner and basically things that I discovered or things that I thought about as I took advantage of what Karen and the American Memory team did. So almost every image you're going to see is just taken from this American Memory site, the library. So I encourage you, if anything interests you, to really go back to the site and explore it yourself. That's the great thing about it. So anyway, we start with Emile Berliner, as you heard, born in 1851 in Hanover, Germany. And sort of talking about Berliner, there's a great challenge of what to focus on because of his many interests and his many accomplishments. And I list them here. And the American Memory collection and has materials on all of these, and as Karen mentioned, there's a lot more in the collection itself that you could come back and explore. My subject interest is sound recordings, so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is sound recordings, but I do want to sort of look at all of this. This is a photo from the collections of Hanover, Germany, where Berliner was born. Berliner came here in 1870, and his first job was on 7th Street here in Washington, D.C. And I have to say, this is in part what accounts for my great interest in Berliner, is that Washington is not known as the home of inventors anymore. We create paper here, and maybe digital files now. But at the time with Berliner here, this was a center of technology and technology invention. The scrapbooks here include a telegram informing the owner of this haberdashery that Berliner would report for work on May 11th or May 12th, 1870, 141 years ago last week. It's very funny, I did a little talk on Berliner a few years ago, about a year ago, and it was at the Goethe Institute here in Washington. And before I gave the talk, I said, well, you know, here's a thing on 7th Street. Let's see where it is. And oddly enough, it was the exact site of the Goethe Institute on 7th Street Northwest is where this haberdashery was. Anyway, Berliner, his biography talks about he being in Hanover and sort of being technologically inclined, like many young boys at the time. Apparently he invented a type of loom, but he came here to basically get out of the army here, and get out of the army rather in Germany, Prussian army. I want to give a little background on the phonograph and the gramophone and sound recording history. This is a copy of the patent, as you see in December of 1877, of Thomas Edison's phonograph. Thomas Edison is the inventor of the phonograph, the first device to both record sound and be able to play it back. You can sort of see that the image at the top is a side view, and that cylinder, which you can see from the top on the bottom image, was covered with tinfoil, and it was basically etched with a stylus that was driven by the sound of the voice. It was a remarkable thing. If you think about it, no one had ever known that you could, people knew, scientists knew you could record sound. No one ever tried to play it back before Edison, and you could really go to a demonstration like today, and in fact they did Chautauqua demonstrations the year after Edison's invention, record sound, and the publicity talked about how it, you know, the phonograph reproduced sound in no matter what language it was recorded in. Some of the drawbacks of it, it was a rather primitive device, and they did go around and publicize it for about a year. And then after a year, Edison somewhat lost interest in it and went on to go into lesser inventions like the incandescent lamp, which was the next year. Alexander Graham Bell, another person who lived in Washington at the time, or at least had set up a laboratory here in Washington. Bell had won the Volta Prize, the French Volta Prize, for his invention of the telephone, and I believe it was a prize of $10,000, and with that he set up the Volta Laboratory here in Washington. I would assume that Volta Place in Georgetown might come from Bell's laboratory. The laboratory was at 1300 block of L Street, and then the 1200 block, right around the corner, 1200 block of Connecticut Avenue. And Bell and the laboratory itself was manned by Bell's cousin, Chichester Bell, and a man named Charles Sumner Tainter. And they worked only a few years, as you see here, 9 years after Edison's invention of the phonograph, on an improved device to record sound, which they called the graphophone. All these names, they're trade names. They're patented trademark names like Kleenex or, you know, Coca-Cola. So you couldn't name an improved phonograph unless you worked for Edison. So they came up with a very creative title of the graphophone. And there's the Edison, or rather the Bell invention was, its great improvement was using wax as the recording medium instead of tinfoil. With the tinfoil phonograph, once you took off the tinfoil off the cylinder to make a new recording, the recording was lost. You couldn't really recreate that recording or play it again. With wax, you could just make a new cylinder on wax. I mentioned Washington being sort of a center of technology. The patent office was here. The Smithsonian, which was interested in technology, was here. And these people were brought together here. Interestingly enough, the first effort to exploit the graphophone, really, and the phonograph, because eventually they did combine patents to form a company, was something called the North American National Phonograph Company. And the National Phonograph Company really envisioned sound recording as a business device, as something for dictation. There wasn't a lot of thought initially given to it for entertainment. Edison knew it could be used, and he mentioned that as one of the possible uses, but they thought the way to exploit it for money was as a dictation device. That was another reason why this sound recording technology was being developed in Washington, because they knew we had so many people who gave dictation here in Washington. Edison's, when Edison and Bell combined patents for the Northeast, or I keep calling it Northeast, a National Phonograph Company. They had franchises in different states to exploit this patent. There was the Ohio Phonograph Company, and there was a New York Phonograph Company, I believe. And here in Washington, the phonograph company was called Columbia, after the District of Columbia. So the Columbia Phonograph Company, which later became Columbia Records, is an outgrowth of this very early endeavor, founded here, at least as a local franchise. The dictation didn't work out, but in recording music, it did work out. While it was some of the dealers, one of the dealers in San Francisco, a man named Glass, came up with the idea of a coin-operated phonograph, and he put it into bars, and it was an enormous success. And that was really what saved the phonograph industry in the early 1890s, was this public utility. They didn't call it a jukebox then, but it was a machine, or rather a coin-operated phonograph. Columbia Records in Washington had two locations that I know well. One was Louisiana Avenue. I'm not sure if the building stands, but this building was on the 600 block of E Street Northwest, around the corner from the Shakespeare Theater, the Landsberg Theater, and here it is today. You can sort of see it. They've turned the first, or the ground floor, into an art gallery, but the upper 3 stories are pretty much the way they were in the 1890s. Here is a photograph. These are reproduced from a journal in the collections here, a trade journal, of the parlor, basically, where one would go and buy a phonograph machine. Well, back to Berliner. Berliner had come here, as I say, in the early 1870s, and the first thing he did was he taught German, and apparently he peddled glue. He traveled up and down the Mississippi River as what he called a drummer, a salesman, and then he went to New York City to study at what would become Cooper Union, and he was an assistant to Constantine Thalberg. Thalberg was a chemist who's best known for inventing saccharin. Berliner in 1812 gave an interview to the Boston Globe. This all can be found in the American Memory Collection. He said, "I called myself an assistant, but I really washed bottles for $6 a week. It was not long before I was analyzing sugar. In the meantime, I was studying physics. While keeping the books at a food store, my old employer in Washington offered me a situation. The next year, 1877, I invented the microphone, or loose contact transmitter." And that's literally what he said. I always sort of enjoyed that he could. And Berliner saved the calling card, the business card of Thalberg, and this is glued into his scrapbooks with a little comment under it, as you see. So he talked about inventing the loose contact transmitter, and that is indeed a microphone. The device for reproducing the voice or any sound in Bell's telephone of 1876 that he introduced at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition, the microphone or transmitter was a weak part of that invention. Apparently it didn't work very well, and a number of inventors set to work to try to improve it, and Berliner was one of them. What I find most interesting about Berliner, reflected in this collection, is this young man, pretty much self-educated, who just rolls up his sleeves and dives into lots of things. But the first big one was inventing a loose contact transmitter. With Berliner, with Bell, it was a magnetic pickup. Here, it's sort of looks like a contraption of some sort of drum, but rather than a magnetic, there is a separation, a very small separation between the contact and the variance of the voltage and lots of things that I have no idea what I'm talking about, which created a better way to reproduce the voice than Bell's telephone. Berliner sold his invention, the loose contact transmitter, to the Bell interest, to Bell Telephone. At the same time, Edison was working on a microphone as well, and he affiliated himself with Western Union. Bell was the little company. Bell was the little guy. Western Union was the behemoth that they fought. And ultimately, they litigated these two patents for decades. And I think that the Berliners' resentment of Edison, in part, it was over sort of their rivalry over talking machines, but maybe even more so, since it's older, over the loose contact transmitter. The Bell microphone versus, or the Berliner microphone versus the Edison microphone. And this fight was just basically between Western Union, this enormous company, and the little tiny poor Bell company. And I think Edison actually prevailed in the courts, but by then it was so much later. It was in the 20s. And I think that many of these scrapbooks, I'll talk about this in a second, the scrapbooks that we see are Berliner sort of reconciling himself to what his place was in the 20s, particularly after ultimately losing the patent battle. Berliner moved to Boston in September of 1877 and worked with Francis Blake Jr. And Berliner's microphone, or loose contact transmitter, was incorporated into what's called the Blake transmitter, which was the prevailing invention for telephone. So this you can see on the right. It really pretty much looks like what we think of as an old-fashioned telephone, at least, and it was indeed the one that prevailed in the marketplace. In the 1880s, Berliner returned to Washington and focused his attention on the talking machine. He was now able to do so and experiment more because he has royalties from what he was paid by Bell for his patents. And he started his work 1 year after the Bell-Tainter Gramophone. Berliner did work, and this is his first gramophone. That's what he called it. Couldn't call it the phonograph, couldn't call it the graphophone. It's the gramophone. And they all basically mean the same thing, writing sound. Berliner's first gramophone patent, which you can see at the top, is again a cylinder, and there's a lateral groove in it, a lateral line that reproduces a sound wave. Lateral meaning it goes back and forth. The Edison phonograph, as well as the Bell graphophone, is a Hill-and-Dale or vertical modulation. The sound is reproduced by a needle going up and down. Here it's going back and forth. Bell had also experimented with lateral grooves, and I think Edison as well, so there wasn't exactly that isn't really the basis of Berliner's contribution of his invention. But in 1888, Berliner was invited to the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. And Karen showed you this document online, and I was able to right-click it and paste it into a PowerPoint. And I love this document because this is Berliner's address that he gave to the Franklin Institute with Berliner's annotations on the document. What I think is perhaps most notable of Berliner, because a lot of his actual technical innovations are very technical and they're sort of splitting hairs. The bottom line is, and finally, after a lot of litigation between he and Edison and others, the great Berliner contribution to sound that allowed him to prevail was the fact that in his gramophone disc, a flat disc, the groove drives the needle across the record. In Edison, the machine takes the needle across the cylinder. But in here, the needle's against the groove wall, and it drives the record. It comes down to technicalities like that. To me, there's something a little more important, maybe not, doesn't help you win patents, but in thinking about this over, 125 years, 35 years later, what Berliner's contribution is in part is, from the very inception, he foresaw sound recordings as an entertainment device. He saw it as a home recording device. I mentioned to you that Glass in San Francisco had come up with a coin-operated phonograph, and it was very popular, the coin-operated cylinder. But Berliner's invention, which is at the same time Bell and Tainter are working, sees this thing immediately as something for our edification in our homes. He wrote in this Franklin Institute address that prominent singers, speakers, and performers may derive an income on royalties on the sale of their phonograms, and valuable plates may be printed and registered to protect against unauthorized publication. He's the first and maybe the last record executive to think about paying royalties, and he sees right from the beginning that there might be a problem in copying the phonograms, that is, these recordings. He talked about collections of phonograms may become very valuable, and whole evenings will be spent at home going through a long list of interesting performances. Future generations will be able to condense within the space of 20 minutes, a tone picture of a single lifetime, 5 minutes of a child's prattle, 5 of a boy's exultations, 5 of the man's reflections, and 5 of the feeble utterances from the deathbed. Will it not be like holding a communion even with immortality? Well, we fortunately don't take people's and record their last breaths, but we do oral histories, and Edison actually foresaw those as well. This second page, or last page rather, of the Franklin Institute address, this is his handwriting, and you see here a list of 6 recordings which he would play at the event. Yankee Doodle, Baby Mine, Nancy Lee, and I think that's interesting in view of something I'm going to play for you in a little bit. This is a picture of the machine that was played at the Franklin Institute exhibition, and you see how simple it was. That's one of the great things about it, is one of the things I like about sound reproduction, acoustic reproduction. Your voice creates sound pressure. It drives a membrane which forces that needle into wax or zinc or whatever it is that a master recording is made. Rather easy to understand. No microphones whatsoever. It's all through that recording horn. What was also particularly important about the gramophone, what Berliner called it sound recordings, and the phonograph, was the phonograph was, until the early 20th century, you couldn't reproduce a cylinder. At least you couldn't mass produce a cylinder. You would go into that Columbia studio, which I showed you, that Columbia building, and there'd be a whole line of cylinder machines. And a band would play the piece, and they'd maybe record it on 6 different machines, and then the band would take a quick break, and they'd put 6 more blanks on there, and the band would play the tune again. Some, clever guys came up with pantographic ways where you could sort of copy a cylinder by playing it back and connecting it through tubes to another one to etch a new cylinder, but that you lose a generation. The Berliner gramophone was seen from inception as something where a master recording is made, and then plates are made, and then recordings are pressed. Again, something where it's mass-produced, it's for entertainment purposes. He established a business here in Washington and in Hanover, Germany, where he still had family, where his brother, I believe, as Joseph was. His big offices here were on 1410 Pennsylvania Avenue, and his laboratory was behind that building. It's sort of just to if you see the smokestack, just to the left of the Washington Monument, that's where Berliner's factory was. Can you see that building there, that sort of cube building with a smokestack coming out? And that was the Capital Traction Power Plant. That was the power plant for one of the streetcar companies here in town. And here is his stellar staff. I want to talk a little bit about one of the people. That's Werner Suess sitting next to him. The man on the upper left, I believe upper left, is a fellow named Fred Gaisberg, who I'm going to talk about in a second. Here's some photos from the laboratories. This is the machine room. You can see a lathe. And then here are acid baths where the master recording is reproduced. It has to be electroplated rather, and then copies of that made to make what we now call stampers, the pieces from which shellac records are stamped. Originally his recordings were made on zinc, and then it was sort of later covered with wax. I won't go into the whole process, but these are the electroplating baths. And here's the acoustic recording studio. This is somewhat hard to see, but if you look at the bottom right-hand corner of the sheet music on the piano, and look at that corner and sort of extend it, there's a recording horn pointed toward the pianist. Can you see the recording horn? Here I'm going to show you a close-up of that. And that is the recording process. It's sort of that simple. What looks like a lot of mechanism is a spring motor. I don't think it's an electric motor that's driving the master turntable, but other than that, it is just the recording horn. If you wanted to amplify a recording, here's an experiment of Berliner's to sort of synchronize a recording 6 different ways. I'm sure it didn't work, but it's a nice idea. If you think about you know, how quickly a needle could jump a groove, or think about the scene in Singing in the Rain where things don't synchronize. That's what would happen there. Here's some pictures of the people shipping recordings. The cubby holes on the right would be where each sound recording title would be. And here's a recording of Berliner's family making a record. That's Berliner on the left, behind his machine, and these are probably his children making a recording for fun. In September 30th, 1897, there was a terrible fire at that Capital Traction plant, and the building entirely burned down. This is Berliner's a little framed photo, a group of photos that he had that's in the collection here. Matrix plant of the Berliner Gramophone Company at Powerhouse of Capital Traction Company, corner of 14th and Pennsylvania Avenues, burnt September 30th, 1897. And here is a photo from his collection of the remnants of that building, and sort of something that looks very similar in the Washington Post report of the loss of the building. What's interesting about this report is that it mentions many of the companies that were renting space in this building, but no mention of the Berliner Gramophone Company. It was still a relatively small company. Didn't rate a mention when the Post reported on the loss of this building. I want to show that, though, to make gramophones, you know, you see here $10 to $25 for the machine, but a lot of advertising done, and advertising in newspapers, and also dealers. He opened a retail shop in 1894, probably the first record store in the world. It was at the corner of, in North Charles Street in Baltimore. And this is a picture of one of the brochures that was used. This is, we believe this picture is of his daughter, Louise Berliner King, who grew up here in Washington, and also I think her family donated some materials to the library. The gramophone machine, cheap, you know, hand-wound gramophone machine costs $18. And this is about 1897 or 1898. It's sort of expensive, $450 if you plug it into an inflation scale. A little less than an iPad. Karen showed you this. This is an advanced list of records. What was recorded? And I think I like this. Two factors into what was recorded and what they sold. One was, you know, what they hoped would be popular, but also what would record well using this acoustic technology. This technology that doesn't involve any microphones or electrically amplified playback. So you see a lot of songs by males and only one song by a soprano. The higher voices just didn't reproduce that well. But you're seeing here 3 recitations, Lord's Prayer and a soliloquy from Hamlet, songs by baritones and basses, a German band, cornet duets. Much of the talent that recorded for Berliner really was local talent. Well, it was sometimes off the streets of Washington. I showed you a picture of Fred Gaisberg. Fred Gaisberg began his career playing piano for Columbia. They're making cylinders for uses in coin-operated phonographs. He was born on Vermont Avenue. He was a pianist for Columbia. Then he went over to Berliner and was a pianist for Berliner, and also recruited talent off the streets and other places for Berliner. Served as a part-time, at least as a music director for Berliner. Eventually, he went to the Gramophone Company in England. Berliner had set up the Gramophone Company in England as a wholly owned affiliate there, and Fred Gaisberg went there to work on running the company and recruiting talent, most famous of which that he recorded was Caruso, but also went on to do things like record Elgar, recorded the Schnabel Beethoven piano sonata set. I mean, it's rather remarkable because what he did was he started here in Washington, recording these basically local yokels. One guy who sold patent medicine on Pennsylvania Avenue, George Graham, he sold elixirs, and Gaisberg could see that he was funny, and he had a good speaking voice, resonant, that would record well. He's taken into the studio to record. Here's an ad from 1898 by the Berliner Company, and what are they saying? It's really by Sousa's band, and it's saying, we record for Berliner exclusively. We do not record for Columbia Records. And that was sort of shows early on sort of deception in advertising, at least what they perceived as such, and exclusive record contracts. Well, if I can, I'd like to let you hear a Berliner recording instead of me. This is, I'm going to just play a little of Sousa Stars and Stripes Forever, and just ask you to sort of imagine this. This is 1897, and you're actually hearing Sousa's band in your parlor, in your living room. We take these things for granted now, but I think it must have been, really extraordinary to be able to hear something like this at home. I'm going to turn this off if I can. Oh, I can. Oh, I can't. This was a popular song of the time, The Stars and Stripes Forever. The band records pretty well, but you have to use, if you'd heard, people there had actually heard a band, and they knew the limitations of it. Certain instruments play better than others. I think banjo in particular recorded well. The fact that this piece was recorded in different ensembles, different instrumentation shows, to me at least, it was immediately popular, and unlike other things of the time, remains popular and affecting today. How many years later? 114 years later. Berliner's was limited. His recordings did have limitations. You heard some of the sound problems. They didn't record as well as they might have. He was always looking for a motor that kept its speed, constant speed, and learned of a machinist in Camden, New Jersey, and hired him to build motors. His name was Eldridge Johnson, and his motor was successful. It was both regular in speed and silent. Berliner's partnership with Johnson, Johnson, being just a machinist, though, threw himself into the recording industry and made quite a few developments. I'm not going to go into all of the details of it, but I'll touch on Johnson in a minute. Later on, he's came up with the invention of a wax master instead of this zinc master that's covered with fat or something, which created a quieter recording. Also, the idea of a paper label on records is Eldridge Johnson's development, innovation. Eldridge Johnson's company, which I'll go into in a minute, was Victor Talking Machine Company. And this is a little bit of Victor publicity, the birthplace of Victor, this little garage, basically, in Camden, New Jersey. Going back to, now in Philadelphia, the Berliner company's doing pretty well, and they're making these Johnson machines, which are lined up on the floor. They're lined up on the shelf. Here is not a Ku Klux Klan meeting, but horns, amplification cones for the gramophone being packed for shipping on the floor of the Philadelphia plant. As I said, he had expanded to both England with the gramophone company there, and to Hanover, where his brother Joseph set up the Deutsche Grammophon Company. All of these coming out of this little tiny company in Washington, D.C. A little sidebar was that in a painter, Francois Barrault, went to the Edison company in England and said, I've made this painting of a dog listening to a phonograph. Here's the dog listening to the phonograph. Would you like to buy it? And the Edison company said, no, we're not interested in this at all. And there's the dog listening to a cylinder machine. Then they went across the street or wherever to the gramophone company, to the Berliner retail shop, and someone there said, yeah, I think that's sort of nice. But we don't want a phonograph in it. You're going to have to put a gramophone on it. And so Barrault went back and repainted the painting and replaced that that cylinder player, that phonograph, with a gramophone player, and with Eldridge Johnson's player. And this is called the patent model. And Berliner understood the value or appeal of this image and patented it as a trademark here in Washington. And it's probably, with Coca-Cola, probably the most famous trademark of the 20th century at least. Not as well known today. But anyway, in 1898, we learned that Berliner had sold 713,000 records, 713,000 records in a year on this new technology, recording discs. And as I said, by then he had Fred Gaisberg was off. He had gone to England. And I'm going to skip a little because I had some recordings to play, but there just isn't really time. But Gaisberg was there, and what happened was Berliner had an exclusive distribution agreement with a man named Frank Siemens from New York, and basically they couldn't make machines fast enough for Siemens. And Siemens had customers demanding these machines, and Siemens had his own machines made. And that's in violation of his contract. It's Berliner's patents, and they had a falling out. Berliner cut off his supply of machines since Siemens was basically pirating his machines. And Berliner sued, Siemens sued, and Berliner lost. And he was forced out of business in about 1900. However, Eldridge Johnson, his machinist who had done all this other work, took it up right there and with Berliner's patents, and with Berliner as a minority stockholder, founded first the Consolidated Talking Machine Company, and a few months later changed it to the Victor Talking Machine Company. So I think it's a shame Berliner was thrown out of business basically by distribution agreements, but I don't feel too sorry for him. I think he did pretty well. He's out of the record business in 1901, but his sons had set up a record business in Canada, the Berliner Gramophone Company of Canada, which thrived, and he had this home where much of his scientific work was done, and this was at the 1400 block of Columbia Road, Northwest, 1458 Columbia Road in what we now call Columbia Heights. Here's it's an apartment building there today. The house was torn down sometime after his death in 1929. Next door to Berliner lived his son-in-law, Joseph Sanders. And Joseph Sanders did a lot of work with Berliner on particularly compounds for making records, what made up the shellac record. And the collections here have Sanders' diaries with the secret formulas for making the shellac disc. I mean, the disc had to be moldable, had to be quiet, but it also had to withstand the very heavy pressure of a stylus on it. Sanders lived next door to Berliner in this home, which is still there. And it was Joseph Sanders' son who donated much of the collection that you're looking at today. So I'm just going to talk real fast about some of the things Berliner did after he's out of the record business in America. One of the first things is he's working here. This is, Karen talked about him just etching ideas on backs of pieces of paper. Here's a little piece of paper we found with C. Francis Jenkins. C. Francis Jenkins was another Washington inventor who basically made a crucial improvement to one of two people, with Thomas Armat, made this crucial improvement to Edison's movie projector, which made movies, which allowed the film to stop in front of both the camera and the projector without a jerking motion. And here they're looking to make a talking and projecting stereoscopic moving picture. And they just sort of made this little note. Those are mirrors down at the bottom in some way, 1905. He worked with his son Henry on inventing a helicopter, and did this on Columbia Heights, right off Girard Street, off 14th Street. This is a motor that you see that they made and they were successful with their helicopter. They used to exhibit the helicopter down on the Air and Space Museum, but it was sort of a ruined one. It was a wreck of a one, sort of in pieces, that they showed as the challenge of preservation. It was right outside the gift shop there. It may still be there, not sure. Anyway, this was a rotary engine, like remember the Wankel engine in a Mazda, I think, for the helicopter, because it was light. Of course, an airplane engine has to be light. And that was with his son Henry in 1922. He invented an acoustic tile something, I think it was an asbestos acoustic tile that was used throughout Washington. And I know there was one in the Oyster School here. There was one in Drexel University that may still be there. But it was one of his last inventions that he put a lot of work into. But then he also just did a lot of philanthropic work. In the middle of all these inventions and this mind constantly coming up with ideas and working and tinkering, here, in honor of his mother, he gives a fellowship for women scientists, which we just discovered in the scrapbooks, which I think is very interesting. One, this is Carolyn McGill wins it in 1909. The wonders of the web are that you can sort of put in Carolyn McGill's name and find out that she was a physician, who was a pioneer, worked in Montana, and her papers end up in Montana State University. But just women for this. And then, as Karen mentioned also, he did a great deal of work on health issues, particularly children's health issues, and fought very hard for the pasteurization of milk. Pasteurization of milk was a very, it was a volatile political subject. It was like fluoride in water, that we would be ruining milk by boiling it to making it safe for children. But Berliner worked very hard for it and was ultimately successful. And you see here, long waged fight against raw milk. This is an ad for Muddy Jim, the book that Karen showed you, the health rhymes. And he made these little rhymes up and then hired an illustrator to make this book to teach children hygiene. There's some of the, figure out what some of the subjects were, not all of them. And there's Muddy Jim, which Karen read so well, so you won't have to hear me read it. And even wrote a national anthem, proposed a national anthem, music by him, words by W.J. Newton. This being Jewish American History Month and being here in the Hebraic section, African Middle East reading room, I wanted just to touch on Berliner's thoughts as a Jew and also his work as a Jew. I find it very interesting. I think that he was bar mitzvahed in England, rather in Germany. He was educated as a Jewish young man, but he calls himself an atheist. But he was very, very interested in the founding of Palestine. This is in 1917. And I think that he had a lot of ambivalence as a Jewish immigrant, perhaps in part as a German Jewish immigrant here. He talks here in this first paragraph of his essay, The Social Status of Jews, that Jews are condemned in part because they continue to be different. He's looking for Jews to assimilate. This is a time of a lot of immigration from Western Europe. This is a common theme in American Jewish history. And I think that though Berliner had no interest really in Jewish culture, or certainly not religion, he certainly understood well challenges Jews faced here and around the world, and worked to make contributions to establish Palestine. The scrapbooks that have been digitized in the collection show correspondence with other Zionists during the teens. I think this is a whole area of his life, like many of these areas, that just hasn't been explored at all. We talked also about these scrapbooks in the 1920s. I do think in part the scrapbooks, he's an older man then, his creative days are pretty much behind him, and he's collecting pieces from his history. And I think one of the things that really bothers him is how venerated Thomas Edison was, and how much acclaim Thomas Edison had. And I don't think this was because Thomas Edison's work with a phonograph. I mean, we do have to remember, the light bulb and things like that, and what Edison did for rural communities in particular. But I just know from the scrapbook how much it irked poor old Emile Berliner when Edison was given this terrible looking sculpture, actually, that was called Orpheus Discovering the Gramophone Record. And Edison, and you see, and so it's a Greek god with a discus, but they've made it into a gramophone record. And Berliner, there's a little close-up of it with Edison himself by it. And I know that irked him because I know that because in one of the scrapbook pages, he wrote something in the margins about just how angry and frustrated he was by this. There was a biography of Berliner written in 1920s by Frederick Wilde, who was a very early radio announcer. I have a feeling this biography was commissioned by Berliner. It's not particularly interesting, but it is the only biography, full-length biography of him that exists. Here's a little letter we found in the Berliner collection, and I'm going to conclude by reading that to you. And this is written on a stationery on Columbia Road, and it reads, "When I go, I do not want an expensive funeral. Elaborate funerals are a waste of money. The kind advertised for $125 plus extra for autos is ample. I've always admired the plain pine coffins of old with a black cloth thrown over. A long bar handle on each side could be added. I would like Alice to play the first movement of the Moonlight Sonata, and at the close, maybe Josephine will play Chopin's Funeral March." These are grandchildren or children. "Please give some money to some poor mothers and babies and bury me about sunset. I am grateful for having lived in the United States, and I say to my children and grandchildren that peace of mind is what they should strive for." May 9th, 1927. So in sort of playing a little bit on Berliner's remarks that one who records could have a communion with immortality, I'll close by playing this record that Berliner recorded in Canada for Bobby Frank, who was the son of Louise Berliner, the woman on the front of the little girl in front of that little pamphlet, winding the gramophone. And here he's giving a bottle to Bobby, but recorded this at his son's record company in Canada for Bobby.
Hello, Bobby. I'm going to sing for you. Listen. I can let up from thy sire, baby mine. I could read and never tire, baby mine. He is sailing over the sea, he is coming back to me, he is coming back to thee, baby mine, he is coming back to thee, baby mine. I'm going to sing you another one. Listen to this. Oh, see that watermelon and smiling through the fence. I wish that watermelon it was mine. Oh, the white folks they and foolish and they ain't got the sense for to keep that watermelon on the vine. And moon and sweet, bacon and good, possum fat and very, very fine. But give me, oh how I wish you would, of the watermelon growing on the vine. How was that? Good night. Sleep tight. Don't let any mosquitoes bite.
So Emile Berliner, no question, a German intellectual, self-taught, at the end of his life, recording minstrel songs in America for his grandson. It makes me proud. Berliner died in 1929 in the Meridian Mansions at 2400 16th Street. This apartment building still stands. You see it here thanks to Google Earth. It was designed by a prolific local architect, A.H. Sonneman, and it was here that Berliner left us in 1929. So I very much encourage you to go to the website that Karen and her team developed and delve into Emile Berliner's life for yourself. You'll find a lot more. I'm only able to touch on some highlights with this overview. Thanks.
Because it's late, we only have time for a few questions, but I think both of our speakers will answer any questions that you have. Yes.
Yeah, that's the book I mentioned by Frederick William Weil, Berliner, maker of the microphone. So I was asked about this book, and also about where 78 RPM as a reference for these recordings comes from, and finally, your first question was about whether Berliner had a hand in choosing the repertoire. Yeah, Edison had a very strong hand in choosing repertoire, and Edison was deaf. If you go reputedly at the Edison site in New Jersey, where his factory was, there's a phonograph with teeth marks in it because he could hear through his bones, and he'd bite into the top to listen to his recordings. Berliner, the evidence is that this is a small company, and I think it's clear he did have some influence. I pointed out when that first recordings he made at the Franklin Institute included "Baby Mine," and of course that's the first song he sang for Bobby, which I would indicate, I think indicates a personal interest. But I think that these people are businessmen. They want to record what sells. Edison had issues with certain kinds of music. He hated vibrato. He liked old-fashioned music, so you get much more 19th century heart songs and things in his music. I don't think Berliner had that kind of influence, but he wasn't. Well, he's only in the record business for 8 years, or something like that. So I can't answer that definitively. In terms of where 78 came from. The 78s, as we call them now, weren't called 78s really until there were new formats in the late 1940s. The 45 RPM record developed by RCA Victor, and the LP, or 33 RPM micro groove long-playing record LP by Columbia. At that time, we start calling them 78s. In the early years of these single recordings, there wasn't a common speed. Many of the Berliner discs play as slow as 60 RPM or as fast as 80 RPM. But 78 really, we feel, didn't come into widespread use, or at least as anything approaching a standard, until the electrical era, until after 1925. There's a little bit about where the term 78s comes from in the new Library of Congress National Jukebox website, which is devoted to acoustical recordings. Don't want to forget that.
Thank you very much. I'm guessing that the last recording you played us was electronically cleaned up or something, because it was so much more clear than the others.
Did I say when it was made? I don't. Well, these very early recordings you heard, they really are experimenting. These are truly primitive acoustical recordings. But if you look, I want to plug again this National Jukebox, which my colleagues here worked so hard on, which only went online a week ago today, and you'll hear some marvelous sounding acoustical records. I actually think that may be an acoustical recording, the one of Berliner, but it's just a better shape. I mean, and they very much knew what they were doing, in part because of this partner of his, Eldridge Johnson, coming up with wax masters and ways to make quieter pressings. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.